Okay, so I will start then. So good morning, and thank you all for joining us today for this exciting session that forms part of the Flone Initiative's Women in Transport Africa Conference. My name is Ariadne Baskin, and I will be moderating the session today. I will start off by officially launching our new study and its accompanying report and website on gender data, and then hand it over to Louise, the Global Partnership Lead from Where is My Transport, to deep dive into the report and showcase the chosen methodology. Before we move on to a candid conversation on what happened on the ground in Lagos and Nairobi during our data collection efforts with Olamide Udoma Ejora, the CEO of the Lagos Urban Development Initiative, and Milka Asamba, an independent research consultant from Nairobi. We know from time and time again, if we do not count women, if planning processes do not explicitly account for women, solutions will benefit men, explicitly privileged, wealthier men. In order to ensure that we as organizations, as city governments, drive policy changes and plan transport initiatives that are truly gender sensitive and inclusive, it's important that we collect the best possible evidence, the best possible data to build a case for change, a case that is representative and addresses the needs of not only 50% of the population, but as we know, in many countries, in many cities, accurate mobility information is hard to come by, and obtaining gender representative, gender sensitive data on public transport dynamics is even more of a challenge. To unwind this challenge and to present our work, today I have the great privilege to launch this exemplary in-depth study that was commissioned by the Transformative Urban Mobility Initiative, Tumi, and produced by Where is My Transport, titled Decoding Women's Transport Experiences in Nairobi, Lagos, and Gauteng. With the report, we have a brand new spanking website, which will serve as a Women Mobilize Women platform for data on women in mobility, outlining methodologies, exploring different respondent portfolios, and providing city comparisons. For instance, as you can see, the journey map and pain points of Oluwakemi. Where did she take the dad phone to? How much of her earnings were spent on it? And was she comfortable with her kids? And so forth. And portfolios of different cities. So before I hand it over to Louise, I greatly encourage you to visit the website www.genderdata@womenmobilize.org and get in touch with Tumi on your insights. Louise, over to you.
Thank you, Ari, for that great introduction. I'm just gonna quickly share my screen. All right. Is it coming up okay on screen for everyone?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Ari. And thank you to the Flone Initiative as well for inviting us to speak and giving us the floor to share more about this, this really exciting report. As Ari mentioned, this is kind of a first for Africa in terms of the comparative view. It brings to light on gender behaviors across the continent in transport, and also showcasing new qualitative methods to highlight gender data in that space. And before I dive into my presentation, I wanted to share a very brief introduction about Where is My Transport. So we are a mobility technology company specializing in transit data collection across developing cities. And our aim is to create data-driven insights and tech solutions that can help our clients build more sustainable transport systems. So our company was started in Cape Town in 2016, and our work really spreads across the globe. We've worked in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, and our projects are quite wide-ranging in scope. So in the last year, we've worked on mapping the informal transport network of Lagos. We've built a journey planning app for Mexico City, Lima, and Bangkok called Rumbo. And we also worked with the Transforming Urban Mobility Initiative on this study, which I'm here to tell you about today. So in the next few slides, I'll be walking you through a high-level overview of the report, telling you a bit more about what motivated the study, the research objectives, and the approach that we took. And I'll leave all of the kind of in-depth findings to our local researchers who led on the ground, Milka and Olamide, who will be joining us in the discussion after this presentation. So I'd like to start by contextualizing the work with some quick facts. As Ari was hinting at earlier, transport is not gender neutral. It's well known that women are more likely than men to experience challenges when it comes to moving around cities, and they face heightened issues around safety and accessibility, among many others. And this has important repercussions on their ability to achieve their full potential in society. There's a study by the International Labour Organization that found that these kind of safety and accessibility challenges reduce women's participation in the labor market by 15.5% in developing countries compared to developed countries. And yet, despite these limitations, transport policies for most countries remain unrelentingly gender blind. And unfortunately, design, planning, operational projects in the transport sector largely fail to address gender-specific needs. And the data gap can in part be blamed for this oversight. This has repercussions on how women's mobility needs are understood, accounted for, perceived. And this is especially the case in developing cities where, kind of as a rule of thumb, openly accessible, reliable, up-to-date, accurate data on this particular topic is non-existent, mostly non-existent. So all this paints a pretty discouraging picture of the transport landscape women have to navigate through. But there's a quote by Caroline Criado Perez that I think it's worth to remind ourselves of, which is that one of the most important things to say about the gender data gap is that it's not generally malicious or even deliberate, quite the opposite. It's simply the product of a way of thinking that has been around for millennia and is therefore a kind of not thinking. So our attempt with this report was to push people to not fall into that trap of not thinking, and to also equip them with a way of collecting that data and showing them a roadmap for how to tackle this issue. So our research set out with 4 key objectives. The first was to bridge the public transport gender data gap and create this comparative evidence base of women's mobility experiences in 3 African cities. We also wanted to pilot a methodology that showcased innovative ways of collecting and producing gender-sensitive data in the transport sector. Thirdly, we also wanted to highlight the diversity of travel experiences across different women groups and kind of move away from that generalistic understanding of women's usage of transport. And finally, we wanted to provide a roadmap and methodological guide that could inspire city practitioners to address the gender data gap and develop more people-centric solutions. So how did we roll out this research? In the next few slides, I'd like to take you through the methodology, the research activities in a bit more detail, the data points and the parameters that we looked at, as well as some high-level findings. So we conducted our study over a period of 5 months across the 3 cities of Nairobi, Lagos, and in the province of Gauteng, focusing more specifically on Johannesburg and Pretoria. And it involved over 500 research participants in total. So in each city, our research was rolled out in the phased approach that you can see on the right of the screen. So it would start always with a literature review, in-depth desktop research and interviews with locals to really understand the landscape, understand sort of what had been already researched, not duplicate the work, and sort of some of the limitations also of previous efforts on this topic, and also to really kind of contextualize the methodology, the survey questions to the context of the city. That was then followed by a preparation and planning of our field activities, sourcing the space to conduct our research in, finding the research participants, and so forth. And then we moved into all of the different research activities, which you can see in blue, and which I'll go into detail in the next slide. So what we relied on with this research was a mixed methodology approach of both online and in-field surveys, ride-alongs, women-only focus groups, and workshops. And I think these last two activities that you see on screen are the ones that I'd like to draw your attention to, as qualitative methodologies sort of tend to be overlooked when we're thinking about transport planning, well, data that can inform transport planning initiatives, and generally also when thinking about how to fill data gaps, there tends to be sort of a bigger focus on quantitative data. And the reality is that qualitative data, as we all know, can also offer a lot more depth and richness in some cases to what one would otherwise get with just traditional survey responses. So with ride-alongs, what we were doing here was following the participant on their commute, observing them at every stage of their journey, asking questions throughout, from the moment they were preparing to leave their house, getting the cash ready for the public transport, to the final stages where they would offboard the vehicle and walk to the destination. So with the workshops, again, the focus here was on kind of getting that holistic view of the transport experience, and getting women to map all of their environmental, physical, informational kind of decision points that would influence their decision-making throughout their journey. And one of the key findings from piloting these research methods alongside our surveys was discovering that participants' answers would vary quite a bit depending on which method was being used. So in Lagos, for example, in the surveys, when asked what transport improvements women wanted to see, the majority of participants spoke about cost reductions and improving infrastructure, creating better roads, improving the standards of vehicles, and so forth. But during the workshops, when asked the same question of what transport improvements would be best suited for their challenges, the focus really shifted to the topic of safety. And as women kind of started sharing among one another experiences that they had lived through, we saw kind of an opening up of the conversation that is harder to obtain through survey responses. So I think in those research activities, there were a number of parameters that we were looking at across the board, and most of them are summarized here on the screen. And what you can see and what's interesting to highlight is the blue boxes on the left, where we were looking at different participant profiles. And so the reason for this was that in our literature review, what we learned was that past work on this topic had tended to kind of look at women as one single group, making conclusions with quite broad brushstrokes that did not distinguish between women's different types of mobility patterns or challenges. So one key parameter we were interested in was kind of breaking down that analytical unit of the woman, and instead focus on how different user groups experience public transport. And that's why we decided to involve female participants who are working professionals, students, sex workers, stay-at-home mothers, informal traders, as a way to really go beyond previous study limitations and add more depth to the findings. And in addition to this, we were also interested in how more traditional parameters of cost, time, safety, comfort, accessibility interacted with these different groups. And what we found quite naturally is that different types of women will prioritize different criteria when making decisions around their travel. So on the point of cost, for example, a working professional who has more financial freedom than an informal trader can choose to take, for example, an Uber or a minibus when going to work, whereas the informal trader is constrained, or to use the word that we heard during the workshop, trapped into taking a minibus due to lower purchasing power. And so in addition to those different user groups and parameters of cost, time, access, and so forth, we were also interested in the spatio-temporal dimension of our findings. So what you're seeing here on screen is the journey map that we've built for a student in Gauteng that shows her mobility experience as a whole, and the different behaviors she adopted at different stages of her journey, from what she was feeling to what she was thinking or doing, as she set off to walk to the station, as she alighted, and as she rode the vehicle to get to her final destination. And this brings me back to the point I was making earlier about one of the objectives of this study being to highlight new ways of showing gender data, When we were carrying out this work, really kind of the conclusion we came to was it's not just about how the data is being collected and how it's being kind of formatted. It's also about how it's going to be communicated and presented to those using it to make decisions. And the reason why it's so important to think about kind of data in any sector, really, in those two aspects, is because we often hear things like 40% of women experience safety challenges on transport. But that doesn't really help us understand what kind of solutions or interventions are needed to address this particular safety challenge. And I think adopting this more user-centric lens really helps to understand exactly where the pain points are, how they happen, on what vehicle, at which stage in their journey, and how women are kind of responding or coping with these challenges, depending on which environment and which point in time they find themselves in. So with this research study, you can tell by now, hopefully, that the aim was really to adopt a user-centric, participatory, and behavioral lens to help surface the voice of women through the stories that they were telling us, and to obtain much more granular insights on the actual lived experience of women. So we wanted to understand all of the invisible and visible coping and posturing strategies that women put on to navigate their transport journey. And these are things that, as I mentioned before, do not necessarily come across as clearly through survey findings or bar chart graphics. So there's a lot that we uncovered with our research, and I'd like to share a little teaser of some of those findings, but I'll let again Milka and Olamide tell us a bit more about what they found in their specific cities in Lagos and Nairobi. But just on a very quickly, kind of to highlight one or two, formal modes weren't necessarily perceived as safer than informal modes, with women citing the examples of the BRT in Lagos, for example, where there had been kind of very violent incidents, deadly incidents in the last year, and ride-hailing apps as well, which sometimes there's the assumption that getting into private transport instead of public transport can offer a safer environment. And this was a topic that was kind of challenged by some of our participants in Gauteng, talking about dangerous situations they have been in different ride-hailing companies. There was another topic as well on the sliding trust of scale between women and drivers. In some cities and by different user groups, drivers were perceived as quite threatening or aggressive, whereas in other instances, depending again on a type of transport that was being talked about, the driver could be perceived as a guardian who would be driving their child to school. So I'll just stop there because I'm conscious of time, but I'd like to encourage you, if you're interested in this topic, to really read through this report because it's filled with really rich insights and also hacks to scale this work in other cities. So I'll just like to conclude by saying that there are many ways one can attempt to fill the gender data gap in the transport sector. And what I've highlighted here in this presentation is just one way to address it. And if you're working in the transport sector and you're looking to collect gender data, I'd encourage you to think about the trade-off between quantitative or qualitative data finding. The depth of insights you're going to get through the method you use, depending on which one you choose, the different parameters that you need to investigate the data, yet that where the data will be stored, and who will be interacting with it and to what end. Will it be to build new transport infrastructure? Will it be to influence transport regulation policy or to design a technology solution that can improve passenger services? So those are some of the questions to think about. And whatever it is you're intending to do with the data, if there's one thing we learned through this research, it's that the first step to filling the gender data gap is giving more women a voice in the process. And if we want to promote inclusivity in transport system, we need to start with inclusive data collection that can depict behaviors, mobility needs, and capabilities on an individual level as well. So thank you for your attention, and I'll end here and give the mic back to Ari.
Thank you, Louise, for that very insightful presentation and for highlighting the need for user-centric, participatory, and behavioral data methodologies to truly capture intersectional realities. I would like to remind everyone that this report is available with a user-friendly website that includes additional data to navigate. I added the link in the chat. I will now move into a moderated discussion on insights from the ground with Udoma, the CEO of the Lagos Urban Development Initiative, and Milka, an independent research consultant from Nairobi. So Udoma, what were your main findings in Lagos? And then Milka, in response, are these findings similar to Nairobi? And what surprised you most from your work on ground? Thank you.
Hi, Ari. I don't know if you already, because I missed part of the question. So did you ask what surprised us most?
So I asked, what were your main findings in Lagos and what surprised you the most? And then I would like Milka to respond to you.
Okay, fantastic. So I think the main findings, quite a number actually, quite a lot of findings, but the first one I'd say is that safety and childcare. So safe transport options actually matter a lot when it comes to how you send your children to school. And so one of the examples that one of the ladies said, for example, was that she has to make a close relationship with like the keke driver or the downfall driver to ensure that her children are transported safe. Another thing that comes with like childcare was the safety and harassment on bikes. So ensuring again about this idea of safety, but also childcare and where the line is in terms of what type of transport you choose. Also caregiving. So a lot of women, 51% of respondents travel daily. When they travel, they actually have to do school runs in between their travel. So again, one of the issues you had to how to decide what kind of transport to take, and also the fact that you're making multiple trips throughout the day, including, of course, caregiving. Also that income influences the type of mode that women choose. So cost was a very big aspect, like affecting what transportation you choose. Of course, safety, I think everyone understands that women safety is a big issue as well, but cost came up, especially with the market women and those who are older, where safety came up a lot more with kind of young people, young women, young ladies, students, when we were interviewing them. And I think Louise mentioned about ride hailing and the fact that safety is not just on the informal public transport, but also on the formal and even sometimes the cars, individual transportation, which was quite interesting because, you know, you wouldn't think that if you're thinking about what choice of mode. But even this fact of safety, that even though it's important, working women, people who work, actually came up and said that they would still choose e-hailing services over public transport because of the comfort and the ease of transportation during their working day, especially during their working day. Also, 52% indicated being dissatisfied or extremely dissatisfied with public transport. And this is not a surprise because, you know, public transport is quite chaotic. It's not on time. It isn't timed. In Lagos anyway, it's not timed. And also, you know, there are so many incidents of harassment and so on. But what was interesting is that 3% actually expressed satisfaction. So, and they talked about the fact that these are spaces where they talk to other women, they engage in conversations, they gist, they listen to music, they engage with like the outside public, which they may not necessarily do at home. So there was still that aspect of satisfaction. And I think this is quite important because then it talks of, you can learn from this. You can learn from the fact that actually there are spaces where we can make better rather than, oh, these are actually terrible, we just need to get rid of it, you know? So there's some highlights in that aspect. Again, about harassment and violence, out of the 91 women who had witnessed or experienced an incident on public transport, only 10% went to express complaint to the driver, and only one woman out of the women that were surveyed went to the police. So, I mean, it really shows again here the fact that the harassment isn't necessarily what just happens on the bus, but also can they report it? How do they report it? How often do they report it? So we have to increase that gap in terms of, you know, enforcement or engagement with women who are affected by harassment and violence on public transport. And lastly, about coping mechanisms. So a lot of women did mention the coping mechanisms that they do when thinking about how to engage on public transport. And one of the examples was that they have to kind of assess the transport before they get on it. So looking to see if there's other women on the bus, looking to see how many people are on the bus, and just things like that. Even when choosing your Okada rider, so trying to understand, is he someone that looks responsible? Will I be safe on this motorbike? And things like that. And also, which was again interesting and new to me, was that ticketers, for people who sell tickets when you're about to board on the bus, they don't wear their uniform. They only wear their uniform when they're at work, but once they have to do anything outside of work, which means changing multiple times during the day, just to avoid the fact that when you're wearing a uniform, you're attracting the wrong attention. And of course, they're carrying money. So again, they don't want to have that feeling of safety and security. And I guess what surprised me most while carrying out the research was that a lot of people actually had a really good understanding of how public transport system works, the policies that actually affect public transport, and therefore there's room to really include these end users of public transport in decision making. They really do understand what they would like to see, where the changes could actually happen, and they can have the discussion with decision makers. Because sometimes you may feel like, or decision makers may feel like there's a gap between the information that the public and the end users know and what the policies that are being implemented. So I think that was one thing that I was encouraged by, but also it was most surprising to me. And then just the last thing, sorry, I've been talking for too long. The last thing was that surveys may not always be the most effective method. It's online surveys, sorry. Were not always the most effective methods in terms of collecting information, especially this kind of gendered information about public transport, mainly because a lot of people who use public transport don't necessarily have the time to sit and do a survey online, because they're going to use their phone and all of that kind of thing. So I think what worked really well was the fact that we went out to meet people, we asked them questions, we had workshops that really brought people together, allowed them to open up as well. So those were my surprises and insights of the research.
Thank you, Olamide. Milka, would you like to give some insights from Nairobi, see how they complement, how they perhaps are different?
Yeah, so sorry again, videos, technology choosing to let you down when you most need it. My apologies for not being on video. But again, yeah, just for the results, again, so similar to what came out in Nigeria. I think the only difference would be in terms of the payment systems, where in Kenya we have the advantage of paying by M-Pesa, which would really sort out quite a number of issues for many commuters. But again, you find that many matatus refuse M-Pesa. And I think there's an opportunity there to actually pursue and figure out how can this work for commuters, because the fact that people don't get change or they don't have sufficient money to pay has always been a thorny issue that has sometimes led to even death of some people when they're thrown off the matatus. So then I'll just go on to some of the things that maybe surprised me, but should not have really surprised me. And the harassment by touts, yeah. I mean, touts would throw words at you at the end of the day when you're getting into matatus or when you're leaving, and you never quite think about the trauma or the emotional abuse that the people who receive it feel. So women would really feel disrespected, they would feel disenfranchised, and maybe just going back to the SACCOs and thinking about how the SACCOs can actually work with the drivers and the touts to ensure they have some discipline there. Informal traders being the worst treated, with their matatus being the West. Some of the matatus would go into like maybe going to the Gikomba area would be stinking, they'd not be cleaned, the touts the smell, their breath would be smelly, and just how that also reflects on the people who are entering into those matatus and how that makes them feel about themselves. And of course, many of the traders would be the women. So again, just that disrespect coming out on the women, and how they feel about it. And then people with illnesses like gout, arthritis, high blood pressure, and how it affects their legs, and how then it affects them when they're entering the small matatus. We never quite think about that and the comfort of people when they're having such issues. And finally, when parents spend time with their children, maybe they've gone for an outing or they've gone to church, or maybe when their children are ill, it's some special moments that you honestly do not want to encounter the harassment of public transport. So for that, even if you do not have the money, then you'd want to get a taxi or a cab and pay the extra sum of money instead of going into the normal matatu harassment that we are used to. So that would be some of the surprises that came out for me doing the study in Nairobi.
Thank you, Milka. So before I open it up for the floor for one or two questions, I'm going to ask one more question to our two ladies. So how would you like to see these findings replicated in other cities? And if they were to be replicated, like you said, Olamide, would you warn against just using survey data and so forth? If you could respond, Olamide.
Sure. So I guess the big thing for this data, I think it's needed data. It's not something that we can easily get access to, or it hasn't been done previously, especially in Lagos. I'm sure even for the other cities that were also the research was conducted in. So again, I think what's really important here is that decision makers, policy makers, even organizations like ourselves, civil society, use this data to kind of start thinking about solutions and action plans of how we can change how mobility is experienced by women and men as well. But since this is about the fact that we've kind of designed cities so far from a male-dominated perspective, then also I think this data kind of is a starting point for more. It really should propel even organizations like myself, but also decision makers, to do more of this type of data collection. And so the question is then how can we do better, or how can we kind of grow this data collection methodology and so on. My recommendations is that firstly, we need to understand the context, which I think we did very well within the cities that were done, this data was done in, research was done in. But the understanding the context really pushes you to create a methodology that works. And I think that's what Where's My Passion was able to do within the different cities. They're learning from what has worked in one and able to kind of think about, okay, how will this work in another city? How do we kind of make the methodology work, and if do we need to remove some things or add some things. And then I would also say that, of course, the sample size was quite small. So, we're targeting women, but of course, the population of Lagos is 20-something million. And we can't access every woman, but if we can increase the sample size, I think that would be great. And of course, if this kind of data has been collected in other cities, it's really necessary. And then, as I said before, more in-person surveys, I think would work and really highlight the nuances of how women use public transport. That's it from me.
Thank you. Milka?
Just to build up on Olamide again, I think for me, what really stood out was the qualitative aspect, the ride-alongs and the focus group discussions. And I think that really gave quite a bit of voice to the consumers. I mean, we got to understand and feel their emotions. We got to really know how that impacts on them, because it doesn't just impact them during the journey, it also impacts their days, it impacts their self-worth, their self-esteem and stuff like that. So for future, I think just focusing on that, the journey mapping, the emotional mapping, because then that would also inform the policy makers, when they're choosing the kind of matatus that should be in place, then should they also focus on the kind of what is comfort, yeah, that is needed within those matatus, and how does that then impact on the safety that women feel when they're in those matatus? That is what I would add. Yeah.
Thank you. So I'm cognizant that we only have 6 or so minutes left on the clock. I would like to open it up for maybe one question, if there is. Otherwise, I would like to say that certainly, as Olamide said, this data is a starting point for more. Women Mobilize Women is committed to work on this topic and develop our platform with more and more robust data. We have actually conducted another study in Lagos and some other cities whose data will be filtered in so that we can really start having a platform that people can access, and we can build towards more evidence-based policy that truly captures the intersectional realities of women on the ground. So with that, I would like to thank our panelists. Thank you, Olamide, Milka, and Louise. I would greatly encourage you to look at the report, go browse the website, and to reach out to Tumi if you have any more insights and any more knowledge on the topic. And yes, thank you. And thank you